Hi, I'm Jon Melsetter, a Norwegian dude, so please excuse my accent, who's doing a master's degree in educational resources, but I also have a great interest in online sharing culture. I've made this Prezi presentation originally in answer to another user on Reddit, but I hope others can find a use for it as well. Today I'll be talking about structuralism, a concept that is still relevant in a lot of disciplines. The 20th century blasts off with modernity's entry as influential processes of thought in all aspects of thinking in the Western world. With this introduction comes a new, empiric, cold, and distanced gaze. A gaze previously reserved the natural sciences, which now turns this gaze inwards with a new set of eyes. With renewed zeal, man starts to review himself, pick himself apart, and examine all aspects of ourselves. This is why it's perhaps possible to say that everything in the 20th century starts with language. Now, if language is anything, it is above all social. Language is a practice of being a human being living in a social group, a small town, a nation, a world community. And when talking about language in general, as constitutive of a society, or as a tool to define a more formal group of users, we're talking about discourse. Discourse lets people share a set of understandings about specific aspects of the world. Broadly defined, structuralism is an approach to human activity that sees this activity as analyzable in terms of relational networks. Ergo, objects get meaning from the positions that they have in this network. Now, since structuralism's appeal lay in its ability to apply systematic and scientific accuracy in fields that traditionally analyzed phenomena in highly subjective and impressionistic ways, it's no surprise that the 60s saw structural analysis move from established communities within itself to areas outside that until then were considered scientifically unworthy. But first, let's get a better hold of what structuralism actually is. Structuralism is a philosophic, sociologic, anthropologic movement that became prominent in the late 50s, early 60s, especially in France, and peaked in the late 60s. It was a direct successor to existentialism, and it was a cool, detached, objective, anti-historical perspective. Structuralism specialized in linguistic analysis of social codes versus the frantic subjectivity and romanticism of the existentialists. It was also a method which, in spite of linguistic roots, could be used everywhere, and thus surpass specialization. Applied in such varied fields as anthropology, literary criticism, sociology, and psychology. So, how does structuralism work? Structural analysis attempts to equate all forms of text by reducing them to the same underlying universal system. This system was articulated through the vocabulary of classical linguistics, but the framework was also transferred to the study of signs and the signs' meaningful elements, first called semiology, later called semiotics, which in turn has had a profound effect on both structuralist and post-structuralist thinking. The structuralist approach stresses interpretations, which emphasize that human actions are guided by beliefs and symbolic concepts, and that these have underlying thought structures that are expressed in different forms. The proper orientation of structuralist studies is to identify thought structures and to study their influence in shaping meaning. They also include analysis of structures, patterns of language, and different media types that take into account this structure and the human conditions for understanding. Structuralism has been called anti-humanistic, or the repeal of the individual. Because of language limitations, it forces users of a language to think in certain ways. So the structuralist would say, is it so irrational to assume that these limits affect actions as well? That makes structuralism deterministic. People are prisoners of language and cannot escape its limitations. Structuralism assesses clothing, etiquettes, myths, gestures, anything really, as languages. So there's less focus on content and more on patterns and structure. But it attempts to offer a new security principle, as Levi Strauss calls it, a science of the permanent. Structuralism has some basic principles which we can talk about. If linguistic and social structures precede the individual, it also means that consciousness is not the place where the individual is established. It rather means that there are deeper social, linguistic, and mental structures that act through us. This means in turn that the notion that man creates his own story through acting is an illusion. Behind human actions are the structures that set the framework for our thoughts and actions. So we can then talk about some basic principles. Social and cultural phenomena don't have essences in structuralism, but rather are defined by their internal structure, or the relationship between the components of a system and their relationship with other relevant social or cultural phenomena. It isolates factors that are important to a culture as opposed to others. For example, the length of a skirt versus its color. One is socially insignificant, the other isn't. By identifying features and how different objects or entities, for example an article, is a sign or a symbol, structuralism tries to reveal the system of implicit conventions or rules that are the basis of members of a particular culture. It attempts to explain how social institutions or systems consisting of conventions can only be discussed or explained through structural analysis. This again is the basis of human experience. Underlying systems with their special rules makes it possible to write a poem, score a goal, be perceived as rude, etc., etc. Structural explanations do not track temporal events and their precursors and connect them together in a linear causal chain. They rather explain why a particular object or action has been given a meaning by relating it to those underlying norms and categories. So structuralism replaces a diachronic perspective, or the analysis of a system that is frozen at a given time, with a synchronous one, rather emphasizes change over time and stresses three factors. 1. Structuralism is less concerned with what might have caused a particular phenomenon at a particular time, but is rather interested in the conditions which make it appropriate and important. 2. Structural explanations are based on the assumption of the notion of the unconscious. For example, I know language, I can speak and understand speech, but I'm not fully aware of the complex grammatical system that I use. Most of it is actually out of reach for me. It's unconscious and has not been even fully described by linguists. Therefore, the linguist's task is there to describe the dynamics of the unconscious system as evident in my linguistic behavior. Structuralism is therefore in great debt to Freud and Marx, who built their theories on the analysis of underlying systems. And lastly, 3. Since structuralism explains meaning in terms of system that escapes the user's conscious actions, it's therefore inclined to treat the individual's conscious actions as effects rather than causes. The self or subject is not given, but is rather a product of social cultural systems. Methods that structuralism uses. Structuralism focuses on structure, or more accurately, show how the text highlights structure. It looks for the rules that govern interpretive choices. It identifies codes that operate in the texts, and it looks for and identifies binary opposites, since differences generate meaning in any semiotic system. Let's step back a bit and look at history. Where does structuralism come from? Let me just zoom out a little bit here. Important people appearing within the structuralist movement are the linguist Roman Jakobson, anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, literary critic Roland Barthes, and linguist Noam Chomsky. Others associated with structuralism is child psychologist Jean Piaget, the intellectual historian philosopher Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, psychoanalyst, and the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser. But Ferdinand de Saussure is the founder of modern linguistics and is generally regarded as the father of structuralism. Saussure distinguished between actual speech acts or utterances, which he calls paroles, and the underlying system one learns when one learns a new language, and he calls this langue. He argued that linguistics should concentrate on the latter. Saussure called for that synchronous linguistics should take over for diachronic or historical linguistics, i.e. defining the linguistic elements in terms of their relationship with each other. And on Saussure's encouragement, Jakobson and other linguists produced analysis of sound systems in different languages. Alright, structuralism and literature. Structuralism in literary criticism is in part a response to modern literature, which has been very self-consciously exploring the boundaries of meaning. Through its focus on codes and structures, structuralism rejects the idea that literature imitates reality. It sees literature as experimentation with language and codes in a particular culture. So structuralists appreciate literature's probing or exploring of the structuring procedures that people construct in order to categorize and understand the world around us. Aspects of structuralism in literature could be attempts by primarily Jakobson, but also others, to describe literary structures linguistically. The development of narratology, or a narrative science that could identify narrative elements, describe basic structures and rules for the combination of these components, and also analysis of the role that the reader has in making sense of a literary work and the different ways different literary works resist and match the reader's expectations. In Roland Barthes' famous essay, The Author's Death, from 1968, we find the phrase, "The work's death means the reader's birth." There's three variants of this. There's one, the use of language as a structure model. Two, efforts to identify universal features or literary acts. Or three, explanations of how meaning is created in literature. So let's look at the effects of structuralism. Structuralism's anti-humanism stands in stark contrast with other intellectual thoughts. Humanity as a concept is abolished as a social invention finally revealed. History is just a process without subjects, where its structures have been imposed on people through hidden mechanisms that forces them to think in certain ways. The author is therefore irrelevant to the study of a work. The structuralist approach to literary criticism places its emphasis on the scientific method. This means breaking down complex phenomena into their individual components and then to analyze the relationship between them, as opposed to the symbolists who find the majority of opinion in the components rather than the relationships. Structuralism's scientific certainty provided the basis for a collection of several social science disciplines such as art, literature, and popular culture. It contributed a strong link that bound specialized and fragmented fields together. So, structures are derived from an a priori logic in every human mind, meaning that the world has meaning because we equip it with one. And although structuralism began in linguistics, it has been extended to fields such as anthropology, psychoanalysis, literary theory, architecture, and its use as method can be applied to all fields or disciplines with emphasis on scientific results. So, structuralism, you and I. How is it relevant? Well, structuralism introduced determinism as a significant intellectual problem. You are forced to ask yourself if you believe in free will or not. Structuralism provides further understanding of the modern thought and why historical ideologies are so different today. Even though it died, structuralism's death marked the turning point of modernity. Structuralism also examines the full range of the object versus the subject. That's very common in modern philosophy. And it also warns us that we are limited by language and vocabulary, and may inspire us to learn new languages. There are no synonyms. Every word has its own distinct nuances that distinguish it from others. And it also provides or promotes awareness that everything has symbolic value. Each thing represents several things, and it is the chain of those that leads to symbolic structures. Alright, that's it. Just like to throw a little shout out to Reddit, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you.